words spirituality and conflict and competition are never used in the same sentence. We are conditioned to think that spirituality and competition are mutually exclusive. We see evidence of this in our daily lives. In the context of prayer and worship, we wear a spiritual hat and become welcoming, forgiving, and compassionate. But when we wear a work hat and dive into the rat race, that quickly changes and we become the antithesis of welcoming, forgiving, and compassionate. Conflict and competition become the driving force. Why are we conditioned to be this way? If we are able to demonstrate certain good qualities for a short period of time, surely we should be able to demonstrate those same qualities all the time. There is no need to relearn how to be good when we have demonstrated what it means to be good. Goodness is part of the deepest layer of our being and is constantly seeping into the conscious mind. The reason it does not saturate our entire being and hence our life experience is that we are selectively good. Competition through natural selection is integral to the success of the evolution of plant, animal, and human species. According to Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest, there is inter- and intra-species competition, so the best set of genes wins out and eventually the weak ones would be selected out. Competition in evolution is for the greater good, for the long-term evolution of species. Competition amongst the sea of genetic material will never go away. We would not be here today but for the evolution by natural selection. In human beings, physical evolution has reached a plateau for all practical purposes. The body carries remnants of the mechanisms central to the process of evolutionary selection. They are in the form of a fear, fight, or flight response to any external threat. Only the fittest survived external threats during the time of primitive man, and the genes of the fittest survivors got passed on. The fear, fight, and flight mechanism is well documented and essentially involves part of the nervous system that speeds up the heart, increases lung function, and mobilizes muscle groups so they're ready to work at peak capacity. All this takes a tremendous amount of energy, and the body is able to sustain this response at peak functionality only for short bursts. Imminent physical threat, fortunately, may not be a significant factor in most people's lives today, but that has not turned this primitive fear, fight, and flight response into a vestigial flicker that barely registers in the mind. This response is front, square, and center in many of our daily interactions with our own thoughts. The active arm of evolution has been transferred to the mind. Ongoing mental evolution is what we refer to as the path of spirituality. Wherever there is evolution, competition cannot be excluded. This includes the road of spirituality as it cuts right through the mind. When we evolve into good human beings, our bad traits can no longer compete and are weeded out. Conflict goes on along with competition, and both are knocking on the doors of the mind every day. We compare ourselves to others and we work towards an ideal self that we hope experiences a better life than what we perceive as our competitors. Competition is not limited to just sports or business. The mind is in the business of competition. Thoughts are constantly competing for our attention, and they are expert competitors against one another. The biggest prize for any thought is gaining control over our awareness. To win that prize, conflict will have to be created, by which we are forced to take one side or the other. An easy way for any thought to get our attention is by sounding an alarm. Despite solid evidence to the contrary, the mind conjures imaginary threats to which we readily respond. These real or imaginary threats are associated with sudden surges in negative emotions such as fear, anxiety, which get deeply etched into the mind. When such emotions are raw and fresh, the entire mental apparatus freezes and an internal panic alarm is activated. Those who have had at least one such experience in their lives, which probably is everyone, know how unpleasant it can be. Time heals not because it erases past impressions, but it has more to do with the accumulation of new impressions which are heaped on the old ones. We are all carrying such heaps within us ourselves. We rarely venture into the mind deeper than the surface layer of thoughts. Most of our mental housekeeping involves keeping the surface layer clean. That is where our awareness resides for the most part, and everyone wants a clean and livable place. Once we identify with an experience as either good or bad, they don't leave the mind, and soon enough they become like large landfills full of garbage. We cannot help accumulating those impressions, and at the same time we cannot have them in our conscious perception all the time. There simply isn't enough bandwidth of attention to service them all. So we cover them with a nice looking veneer of thoughts on the surface. But that surface layer is very thin and fragile. To many, spirituality means maintaining the surface of the mind clean and pure. But spirituality in its true essence involves the dirty work of cleaning up the garbage and hidden deep in the deeper layers of the mind. The mind is a huge upgrade from the primitive and instinctive responses that are seen in other species of life in the animal kingdom. We don't make full use of this natural upgrade, and we import those primitive instincts into the mind. For the most part, we limit the mind's utility towards ensuring our individual survival, enjoying food and other pleasures of life. In contrast to the highly sophisticated mechanism of the human body, the way we use a mind is crude and primitive. For most people, if food, survival, and pleasure are taken care of, that is considered a good life. That is a foundation for which we compete with one another, and we are perfectly willing to endure conflict and safeguard that foundation. Conflict and competition peak within the foundation of food, security, and pleasure that we seek to maintain throughout our life. But that foundation also contains the seed of spiritual ascent. In the next talk in this series, join me as we discuss how we may turn the primitive mind into the birthplace of spirituality and growth.